In 1971, President Nixon made an announcement that should have caused panic. He declared that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The currency in your pocket was now backed by nothing but a promise. Yet within a decade, the dollar became more powerful than ever. How? Because what happened next wasn't an accident. It was the most sophisticated currency control mechanism ever designed. A system where a handful of institutions could create money from nothing, lend it at interest, and ensure that entire nations would spend generations paying it back. Today, we're going to trace the hidden architecture that makes modern currency obey a small group of financial institutions. Once you see these rules, you'll understand why some countries stay poor while others print their way to prosperity, and why that difference has nothing to do with hard work or resources. Background: to understand how currency became weaponized, you need to know what money actually is in the modern world. Pick up a dollar bill. Read what it says. Federal Reserve note, not United States dollar. A note. A promise to pay. But pay what? That's the question that unlocks everything. For most of human history, money was commodity-based. Gold, silver, things with intrinsic value. Governments couldn't just create it. They had to mine it, earn it, or take it. That limitation frustrated those in power. You can't fight prolonged wars without money. You can't build empires when gold supplies are finite. So throughout history, rulers found workarounds. They'd clip coins, reducing precious metal content. They'd mix base metals with gold. They'd overissue paper notes beyond their gold reserves. But there were always consequences. Inflation, loss of confidence, currency collapse. Then came a revolutionary idea. What if we could create a system where currency could be expanded infinitely, but make it seem legitimate? Where debt could grow forever without immediate consequences? Where the costs of expansion would be hidden in complexity that regular people couldn't understand? That system was designed in the 20th century, and it required three elements: central banks, fiat currency, and a global reserve system. Once these pieces locked into place, currency stopped being a neutral medium of exchange. It became a control mechanism. The architecture began crystallizing after World War II. In 1944, as the war still raged, representatives from 44 nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The official story: they were creating a stable international monetary system to prevent future conflicts. The system they designed made the US dollar the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would peg to the dollar. Stability through American strength? But here's what the history books downplay. The United States held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves at that moment. Europe was destroyed. Asia was devastated. America could dictate terms. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank were created at Bretton Woods, noble-sounding institutions. Their stated purpose: help nations rebuild and develop. But look at the structure. The IMF would lend dollars to countries in crisis. These loans came with conditions, policy changes the borrowing nation had to implement. Austerity measures, privatization of public assets, opening markets to foreign investors. The World Bank would fund development projects, but the money wouldn't go to the developing nation. It would go to American and European contractors to build infrastructure. The developing nation got the debt. Western companies got the revenue. This system had an elegant cruelty. Nations would borrow dollars they couldn't print, spend them on projects that often failed or primarily benefited foreign companies, then spend decades paying back the debt with interests on money created from nothing by the lender. But the Bretton Woods system had a flaw: that gold backing. Countries could theoretically demand gold for their dollars, and by the 1960s, they were starting to.
All day.
The rise throughout the 1960s, the United States ran growing deficits. The Vietnam War was expensive. Social programs were expanding. More dollars were being printed than gold could back. France, under Charles de Gaulle, noticed. He called it America's exorbitant privilege, the ability to print the world's reserve currency and exchange paper for real goods from other nations. In 1965, France began converting dollars to gold. The nations followed. America's gold reserves were draining. The system was breaking. The U.S. faced a choice: stop printing money and accept economic contraction, or abandon gold backing entirely. In August 1971, Nixon chose the latter. He closed the gold window. No more gold conversion. The dollar was now pure fiat, backed by nothing except the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. This should have destroyed the dollar's dominance. Why would nations continue accepting currency backed by nothing? Because the United States had already positioned the second element of control, oil. In 1974, after the oil crisis, the U.S. made a deal with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would sell oil only in dollars, petrodollars. In exchange, the U.S. would provide military protection and weapons. This was genius. Every nation on earth needed oil. To buy oil, they needed dollars. To get dollars, they had to sell goods to America or borrow from institutions that created dollars. Suddenly, fiat currency had an anchor more valuable than gold. It was the only way to power your economy. The dollar wasn't backed by precious metal. It was backed by global oil dependency and American military might. The breaking point, the petrodollar system, created a perfect mechanism for wealth extraction. Here's how it worked in practice. A developing nation needs energy. They don't have dollars, so they borrow from the IMF or World Bank. They use these dollars to buy oil. The oil money flows back to Western banks. The developing nation is left with debt denominated in dollars. To repay the debt, they must earn dollars. How? Export raw materials. Accept foreign investment that extracts resources. Open their markets to American goods. But here's the trap. If they try to develop their own industries to earn more dollars, they face tariffs and trade barriers.
Ow.
If they try to protect domestic industries, the IMF conditions forbid it.
Ow.
If they try to default, they're cut off from the global financial system. The rules ensured that wealth flowed in one direction, toward the institutions that controlled dollar creation. This system worked flawlessly for decades, till some nations tried to break free. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, announced in 2000 it would sell oil in euros instead of dollars. Libya's Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency to compete with the dollar and euro. Both leaders ended up overthrown, their countries destabilized. Iran, Venezuela, Russian nation, attempting to circumvent the petrodollar system, faces sanctions, isolation, or worse. The message is clear. The rules of global currency aren't suggestions. They're enforced. The fallout, the consequences of this currency architecture are staggering when you examine the data. Since 1980, developing nations have paid over $4.2 trillion in interest on foreign debts. Yet their total debt has increased. They're on a treadmill, running faster just to stay in place. Africa provides a stark example. The continent holds roughly 30% of the world's mineral resources. It should be wealthy. Instead, it holds about 3% of global GDP. Why? Because the currency rules ensure that resources get extracted by foreign companies, paid for in dollars controlled by foreign banks, while the profits flow overseas. African nations are left with the debt, environmental damage, and social instability. Latin America tells the same story. Rich in resources. But cycles of debt crisis and IMF structural adjustment have kept much of the region economically subordinate for generations. Meanwhile, the nations that control currency creation, primarily the United States, can run massive trade deficits indefinitely. America imports more than it exports, paying with dollars it can print. Other nations must actually produce to earn those dollars. This is why the U.S. can sustain trillion-dollar deficits, while countries like Greece face existential crises over far smaller debts. When you control the currency that the world needs, different rules apply. A failed fix is every decade or so, there's talk of reforming the international monetary system, creating a new reserve currency, more fair lending practices, debt forgiveness for the poorest nations. These proposals go nowhere, because the system isn't broken not for those it was designed to serve. The IMF occasionally forgives debt, but always with new conditions that deepen dependency. The World Bank announces reforms, but the fundamental structure remains unchanged. Alternative systems have been proposed. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have discussed creating a new reserve currency. China has been internationalizing the yuan, establishing currency swap agreements that bypass the dollar. But these challenges face enormous obstacles. The infrastructure of dollar dominance is deeply entrenched. SWIFT, the international payment system, is dollar-based. Global commodities are priced in dollars. Central bank reserves are held in dollars. And crucially, the military and intelligence apparatus that backs this system is unmatched. No alternative reserve currency has equivalent power projection behind it. The rules persist because they're not just financial, they're geopolitical. They're backed by the world's largest military and most sophisticated intelligence network. Breaking these rules has consequences beyond economics. Modern parallels now, in 2026, we're watching the currency control system evolve in real time. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks began quantitative easing, creating trillions of dollars to purchase assets. This should have caused massive inflation. It did, but not where most people expected. Consumer price inflation stayed relatively low for years. But asset prices, stocks, bonds, real estate exploded. Why? Because the newly created money went to banks and large investors, not regular people. They bought assets, inflating the wealth of those who already owned them. Since 2020, this has accelerated. The Federal Reserve printed more money in 2 years than in the previous decade. The result: billionaire wealth increased by $2.7 trillion during a pandemic while median wages stagnated. This is currency control operating domestically. The rules that extract wealth from developing nations work the same way inside developed ones. Those closest to currency creation benefit, furthest from it working people. Savers watch their purchasing power erode. Meanwhile, the global system is showing strain. China's Belt and Road Initiative is effectively creating an alternative financial architecture. Nations are increasingly conducting bilateral trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar. The response from the dollar system? Financial warfare? Sanctions have become the weapon of choice. Freezing Russia's central bank reserves in 2022 sent a message to every nation: your dollar holdings aren't really yours. They're hostage to U.S. foreign policy, but this weaponization has a cost. It's accelerating the search for alternatives. Central bank digital currencies are being developed globally. Cryptocurrency, despite its volatility, represents an attempt to create money outside the traditional control system. The question isn't whether the current currency architecture will last forever, it's what replaces it, and whether the new system perpetuates the same hidden rules of control. Takeaways: 3 critical things to understand about currency and power. First, money isn't neutral. The rules governing who can create it, who must borrow it, and under what conditions fundamentally shape global wealth distribution. When people say that's just how economics works, they're describing a design system, not a natural law. These rules were written by specific people with specific interests. Second, debt is a control mechanism. Whether it's developing nations trapped in IMF loans or working families trapped in consumer debt, the pattern is identical. Those who can create currency lend it to those who cannot. The borrowers work to repay what was created from nothing. This isn't a bug, it's the core feature. Third, currency power is political power. The dollar's dominance isn't maintained by economic superiority alone. It's backed by military might, intelligence networks, and the threat of exclusion from the global financial system. Understanding this changes how you see international conflicts. Many wars aren't about ideology. They're about monetary architecture. Conclusion: the hidden rules that make currency obey the few aren't complex. They're just obscured behind technical language and institutional complexity. Create money others need. Lend it at interest. Ensure the borrowers can't create their own. Punish those who try to break free. Repeat. This system has concentrated more wealth and power than any empire in human history. Not through direct conquest, but through control of the medium of exchange itself. The system is changing. Technology is creating new possibilities. But technology alone won't free us from these rules. That requires understanding how they work, who they serve, and demanding something different. Right now, most people don't see these rules because they're designed to be invisible, which is exactly why we need to keep talking about them. If this video changed how you think about currency and power, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden architecture of our world. And comment, what questions do you have about how money really works? The rules can't change until people see them. Let's keep looking.